In the annals of true crime, few names incite as much horror as Luis Garavito, the Colombian serial killer who claimed the lives of at least 138 young boys. His reign of terror began in the early 90s, a time when Colombia was gripped by turmoil and violence. In this chaos, Garavito found his hunting grounds. He preyed on the vulnerable, young boys from poor communities, those whose disappearances would go unnoticed in the grand scheme of things. This was no ordinary killer. His methods were brutal, his crimes unspeakable. He tortured his victims, subjected them to horrific abuse, and then killed them in the most gruesome manner. Decapitation, dismemberment. His crimes were the stuff of nightmares, the acts of a true monster. Garavito's reign of terror continued unabated for 7 long years. From 1992 to 1999, his crimes remained undetected, his victims' voices unheard, their plight unnoticed. And then, in 1997, a survivor reported an attack. The monster had made a mistake, and it would lead to his downfall. Despite confessing to over 140 murders, Garavito was convicted of 138 counts of murder. His case not only shocked the world but also shed light on the need for improved child protection measures in Colombia. The magnitude of his crimes, the sheer number of his victims, earns him a horrifying distinction. Luis Garavito is known as one of the world's most prolific serial killers. His name is a chilling reminder of the monstrous capacity for evil that can reside in a human being. Born into poverty and violence, Garavito's life was a prelude to the horrors he would inflict. Born on the 25th of January 1957, Luis Garavito's early life was marred by violence and deprivation. Born into a world of hardship in the Colombian town of Genova, Garavito was the eldest of 7 children. His family was poor, struggling to survive in a society rife with socioeconomic disparities. This challenging environment would be the backdrop to a childhood filled with adversity. His father, a heavy drinker, was a violent man. Garavito and his siblings were often on the receiving end of his uncontrolled rage. The physical and psychological abuse he endured was relentless, casting a long, dark shadow over his formative years. The torment didn't end at home. Garavito was also a victim of sexual abuse by neighborhood men. This cycle of violence, both at home and in the community, was a constant in his life, a grim testament to the vulnerability of children in such dire circumstances. Without any positive role models or any form of emotional support, Garavito grew up feeling alienated. His experiences taught him 2 things: how to endure pain and how to inflict it. As he grew older, these lessons would form the foundation of his monstrous persona. Garavito dropped out of school at an early age to help support his family. He took on various odd jobs, from selling newspapers to washing cars. His life was a strenuous one, defined by poverty and a constant struggle for survival. The seeds of violence and depravity sown in his childhood would later blossom into a horrifying reality. It's easy to draw a line between the trauma of his early years and the atrocities he would commit in his adulthood. However, it's crucial to remember that while many individuals endure similar hardships, very few descend into such depths of evil. Garavito's childhood was far from ordinary, a twisted upbringing that foreshadowed the darkness to come. From 1992 to 1999, Colombia was gripped by a wave of horrific crimes targeting the most vulnerable members of society: young boys. This was the reign of Luis Garavito, a man who would later be dubbed the Monster of Colombia. His hunting grounds were the impoverished, neglected corners of the country, where he found his victims: young boys, often poor, often alone. Garavito's methods were as calculated as they were brutal. He would lure these boys away with the promise of small jobs for quick money, or with simple gifts. A strategy that exploited their innocence and their desperate circumstances. Once isolated, these boys would suffer unimaginable horrors at the hands of this man, who seemed to revel in their pain. Torture, rape, decapitation, and dismemberment. These were the fates that awaited Garavito's victims. But how did he manage to evade capture for so long, you might wonder? Garavito was a master of disguise and manipulation. He would often pose as a priest or a charity worker, using these guises to gain the trust of his victims and their communities. His transient lifestyle, moving from town to town, made it difficult for authorities to connect the dots. It's chilling to consider that while Colombia was celebrating the turn of the millennium, a dark shadow was looming over its past. Garavito's reign of terror spanned almost the entire decade of the 90s, a period marked by fear and loss for too many families. The sheer magnitude of his crimes is staggering. Garavito confessed to over 140 murders, but was only convicted for 138. The true number of his victims may never be known, as many bodies were never found, and many families are still waiting for answers. For 7 long years, Garavito preyed on the innocent, leaving a trail of unspeakable horror in his wake. In 1997, a survivor's report sparked an investigation that would eventually lead to Garavito's downfall. A brave young boy had managed to escape the clutches of the monster, and his testimony ignited a spark that would grow into a firestorm. The authorities began to connect the dots. The brutalized bodies of young boys, the victims from poor and vulnerable communities, the terrible consistency in their fates. It all led to one man, Luis Garavito. The scale of his atrocities was almost unimaginable, but the evidence was irrefutable. The police, with a renewed sense of urgency, began a manhunt that would stretch across 2 long years. As the net tightened around him, Garavito must have felt the walls closing in. In 1999, the manhunt culminated in his arrest. The monster was finally caged, but the true horror was only beginning to unfold. Garavito confessed to his crimes with an alarming nonchalance. He admitted to over 140 murders, a number so staggering it sent shockwaves through the nation, and indeed, the world. Each confession was a chilling testament to the depths of his depravity. Yet, in a twist that would provoke outrage, Garavito's sentence was shockingly lenient. Despite the enormity of his crimes, he was convicted of 138 counts of murder, and was sentenced to just over 20 years in prison, the maximum allowed under Colombian law at that time. This lenient sentence sparked a public outcry, and led to changes in Colombian law, increasing the maximum sentence for such heinous crimes. But for many it was too little. Too late. The damage had been done. The lives of countless boys had been brutally snuffed out, their families left to grapple with an unimaginable grief. Garavito's reign of terror had ended, but the scars he left on Colombia would never fully heal. The wounds inflicted by this monster would remain, a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of our society. Garavito's case sent shockwaves through Colombia and the world, exposing the dire need for improved child protection measures. The revelation of his horrific acts unveiled a grim reality that society had been ill-equipped to handle. The sheer scale of his atrocities targeting young boys from poor and vulnerable communities was a chilling wake-up call to the pervasive issue of child exploitation. In the wake of this terror, Colombia was left to grapple with the aftermath. The nation was plunged into a period of introspection and self-evaluation, questioning how such a monster could have operated in their midst for nearly a decade. However, out of this darkness, there emerged a renewed commitment to protect the most vulnerable members of society. Measures were taken to strengthen child protection laws and increase awareness about child abuse and exploitation. New policies were implemented focusing on the welfare of children, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds. More resources were allocated to law enforcement agencies, and training programs were established to better equip them to handle such cases. Garavito's case also prompted a significant shift in societal attitudes. The public, once largely oblivious to the plight of children from vulnerable communities, became more vigilant and proactive in their protection. Communities began to work together, fostering an environment where children could grow and thrive without fear. But perhaps the most important takeaway from this case is the stark reminder it serves of the evil that can reside in the heart of man. It is a chilling testament to the depths of depravity that one individual can sink to, and a stark warning of the need for constant vigilance in the protection of our children. The story of Luis Garavito is not one that can be easily forgotten. It serves as a harrowing reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the corners of society, hidden beneath a seemingly normal facade. It underscores the importance of community, of looking out for one another, and of never turning a blind eye to potential danger. Luis Garavito may be behind bars, but his monstrous legacy serves as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the heart of man.